Okay, so a few of the topics we're going to talk about, gametes, right? The haploid sex cells in the body. We're going to expect that you understand the process of meiosis and mitosis and how we get daughter cells from our diploid cells, how gametogenesis takes place. We'll talk about components of the reproductive system, the events of fertilization, and then we'll compare how the human lifespan of both males and females progresses, right? Especially how it differs for females. All right, so the reproductive system includes all the organs that are involved in mating, right? And again, mating for the purposes of reproduction, so not just casual mating. Gametogenesis, which is the production of sex cells. Now, you need to differentiate gametes as the haploid sex cells, and they are different from somatic cells. Right? Somatic cells have 46 chromosomes, which is 2 sets, whereas haploid cells or daughter cells or gametes have 23. That makes them haploid. Okay? Some of the structures we'll talk about are the gonads, which are the testes in males, and the ovaries in females. And 2 of the main functions of the testes and ovaries are to produce those gametes, those haploid daughter cells, which become either oocytes or spermatocytes. We'll talk about that process. Their second function is to secrete sex hormones. We'll talk about the different hormones, but these hormones make the gonads endocrine organs in this way. So they're endocrine organs, they secrete those sex hormones and they release them into the blood, and they can travel to various locations and have their function there. We'll also talk about the accessory reproductive organs, such as the glands, which secrete fluid that lubricate the reproductive tract. Those are also important components of reproduction. Okay. All right, so the sex hormones are going to be androgens, which include testosterone, which is secreted by the testes, and then estrogen and progesterone are secreted by the ovaries. Now, although males typically have more androgens, and so the term androgynous really is a descriptive for males or being of males, females have androgens too, okay? And the vice versa is true. Although females typically produce more estrogen and progesterone, males produce those hormones as well. Right, so what we want to understand is that all steroids are found in both sexes in different quantities. And there can be fluctuation of those quantities, right? There are some women who have androgen dominance, meaning that they have, the facial hair, the redistribution of fat, and that sort of thing. So you want to bear that in mind. The adrenal cortex also produces some of the androgens that are circulating throughout the body. Accessory reproductive organs are going to be the reproductive tract, so the fallopian tubes in the case of women. The urethra helps to transport gametes in the case of males, as well as the vas deferens. So anything that's helping to transport the gametes from the gonads to where they need to be in order to meet with a gamete of the opposite sex is contributing to the reproductive process. So in this case, it's going to be the tract and the vas deferens. All right, so fertilization. This is the process where sex gametes from opposite sex meet, and this takes place during copulation. So copulation is the act of mating or sexual intercourse. And this is where sperm is deposited into the female. Now, when we say sperm here, that's not strictly speaking the correct term because it's sperm with the fluid that helps to carry out a few of the functions we'll talk about. So that fluid together is called semen. Those sperm become fertilized when they come in contact with the ovum. So they have to travel through the female reproductive tract, make their way to the ovum successfully before fertilization can take place. Now, fertilization doesn't always happen, right? It's a sort of a shot in the dark. There's a very small window with which fertilization can take place. We'll talk about that window, but it's very important for these timed events. These are timed events to take place in order for fertilization to occur. So after fertilization, right, we have those gametes coming together. They form a zygote, right? It's immediately after fertilization when we have a spermatocyte and an oocyte come together, that becomes a zygote. And then within the first 2 months, it becomes an embryo. And then after the first 2 months, it becomes a fetus. So typically an embryo is what we call the initial stage of that fetus. But as long as it becomes circulated within the uterus, right? The uterus is sort of the descriptive factor when we talk about the fetus. Once it's in the uterus, it's a fetus. Once it's outside the uterus, we then begin to classify it as a child, an adult, a newborn, etc. Now this takes place after 9 months, after which parturition or birth takes place, and that culminates the gestation process. All right, let's talk about some chromosomal issues here and the development of fetus, right? So the sex determination. Now, when we talk about sex determination, I want to make it clear, we're not talking about gender. Gender is how you identify, how the world sees you. That has to do with social constructs and labels and all that stuff. We're talking about sex, so purely biological, right? Whether or not you have an XY chromosome or you have an XX chromosome. Now, if you have an XY chromosome, you're biologically male, and an XX chromosome makes you biologically female. Now, there's an area on the Y chromosome, it's called the SRY gene, SRY standing for sex determining region of the Y chromosome. It's a small area on the chromosome itself, and that is the area that's responsible for the development of testes, as well as the absence of ovaries in males. So specifically for males, the SRY codes for a protein called the testis determining factor. And if this protein is present, we have the development of testes and other male reproductive components. And if this protein is absent, we have the development of female reproductive organs, which are the ovaries, the fallopian tubes, etc., etc. Okay, so the SRY is the area on the gene. The testis determining factor, or TDF, is the protein that it codes for. Now, this brings up a little bit of a question here. We can have biological biological males. So biologically, we can have an individual who has an X and a Y chromosome. And if there's some defect or issue or mutation on the SRY region, we can have the SRY sort of malfunction, not produce that TDF protein and not create the testes and other reproductive structures. And so we have this androgen insensitivity. So basically the patient has androgens, but they don't have the structures because of a defect in the SRY gene. All right, so sex differentiation is controlled by hormones. We know this, right? Testosterone in the case of males, estrogen and progesterone dominance in the case of females. And during the first 2 weeks, an embryo is developing what I like to call developmentally ambiguous, right? Or ambiguous development. So there's no specific sex being identified at that point. So the first 2 weeks, there's no sex being identified. There are no unique gender assigned or sex assigned structures being developed, just sort of ambiguous development. After the first 2 weeks, we have the Wolffian ducts form. And the Wolffian ducts are the precursor to the male tract, so vas deferens, etc. And then we have the Mullerian duct form. And the Mullerian duct are the precursors to the female reproductive tract, so the fallopian tube, the cervix, etc., etc. All right, and so Wolffian ducts are developed in male in response to that SRY gene. Again, so we go back to that SRY area of the gene. Because of this region, because of the protein that we talked about, the Wolffian ducts will come into play and they will develop. Now the testis also secrete another substance. It's called Mullerian inhibiting hormone, or MIH. And this is responsible for the degeneration of the Mullerian duct, right? If you're becoming a male, you would also like for the female precursor structures to regress. And that's what happens with a naturally or normally developing male. The testes begin to secrete testosterone, which stimulate the development of the Wolffian ducts, as well as MIH, which stimulate the regression of the Mullerian ducts, which would otherwise become female structures. Now, if there are no testes present, obviously there's no SRY present, obviously there's no TDF present, so the Wolffian duct regresses and the Mullerian duct progresses and develops into the female structures. Now, this brings up the concept or the idea that the default sex is female, and to some extent that is true. If there was no interruption of the sexual development, a female or female anatomical structures would develop. If there is interruption, again, the interruption is going to be the SRY gene and the TDF protein. That interruption creates the male anatomy, right? So default, If there were no interruption in that developmental process, we would have the development of female structures. All right, so let's just sort of review some of the development here. So again, we have that 2-week question.
If you're having a kid, is it just 50-50?
It's 1 out of 4 chance. If you do that Punnett square and cross it, it'll be 1 out of 4 to be a boy, 1 out of 4 to be a female. Okay. So let's talk about the 2-week process initially. So this is that 2-week area of what I call the ambiguous development. So we have both the Wolffian duct and the Mullerian duct. We have the primitive gonads. Now the primitive gonads can either become the testes or they can become the ovaries. So here we cannot really tell the sex of this developing embryo. Beyond that 2-week mark, we have the male reproductive organs coming through, and that is under the influence of those 2 substances we talked about. The MIH, which is helping to regress the Mullerian duct, as well as testosterone, which is helping to develop the Wolffian duct structures. And again, the Wolffian duct is going to give rise to the vas deferens as well as the seminal vesicles. Now, in the case of not being a male, in the case of no Y chromosome, no SRY, we do not have MIH, so the Mullerian duct is going to persist, and we do not have testosterone, so the gonads will develop as ovaries. Okay. All right, let's talk about patterns of reproductive activity throughout the human lifespan. So typically, puberty is the main time where secondary sex characteristics start to mature. We have the development of gametes, which are those sex cells, and we have the preparation of either male or female for the reproductive process. This typically starts at around 10 to 14 years. Now, this is a broad range. This can be earlier, like in recent times, there's a phenomenon called precocious puberty, and precocious puberty is basically an early puberty. So you have individuals, either male or female, that begin to have gamete production and secondary sex characteristics at 8 years old, 9 years old, 10 years old. And then
12% is second graders.
Mm-hmm. Yep, second graders. So that's pretty drastic.
Does that like have to do with like the increase of like?
Yep. So it's linked to several things. Some ideas is that it could be linked to obesity, the incidence of obesity, and some of that hormone and fat distribution. Other ideas is some chemicals like estrogens and phthalates that are present in plastic and a lot of the things we use. There are lots of ideas. No one has really solidified what exactly is causing it, but it's something that we're seeing. We also see it on the opposite spectrum. So persons that are seeing puberty at 17, 18, 19 years old. All right. Now again, the things that are happening during this phase are the secondary sex characteristics. We'll talk about what those are, such as widening of the hips, pubic hair, etc., as well as sexual maturation in terms of being ready for the reproductive process, and then the production of gametes, which are to help with fertilization, or to bring about fertilization. So during the sexual maturation process, females will get their reproductive cycle or the menstrual cycle. We'll talk in detail about the steps of the menstrual cycle. Then they will go right through to menopause, which is the abrupt ending of that menstrual cycle, abrupt ending of their reproductive function. And that happens very distinctly for women and not so much for males. Males can continue to produce sperm well into their elderly age, 70s, 80s, until death. The quality of that sperm is up for discussion, right? There's increased genetic mutations, et cetera, which come along with having older sperm. All right, let's talk about a few checkpoint questions. So what are the male gonads called? Testes. The female gonads? Ovaries. Besides gametogenesis, what is the gonad's other primary function? Besides producing hormones, good. So that endocrine function, where they produce either testosterone, estrogen, or progesterone, and release that into the blood. What is the distinction between sex determination and sex differentiation, and what are the deciding factors in each process? So sex determination versus sex differentiation. Right, good. So the determination of sex happens beyond that 2-week point where we have either the presence or absence of Mullerian inhibiting substance, and the testosterone, right? And the presence or absence of the SRY gene, more importantly, so the SRY area of the Y chromosome. What about sex differentiation? What is that?
Physical.
Right, so the physical characteristics that begin to develop as a result of that sex determination. So as a result of the SOY gene being present or not, which is sex determination, we have differentiation of physical structures that define either one sex or the other, okay? All right, let's talk about the process of spermatogenesis and the hormonal regulation of spermatogenesis. Here we'll discuss the anatomy of the male reproductive organs. This should be a review class at this point. So we're really going to glide right over the anatomy. Then we'll talk about hormonal regulation in males. So basically how the hypothalamus, the pituitary, both anterior and pituitary, or more specifically anterior, sorry, and the testes have this relationship where they balance hormones in order to bring about reproductive function. We'll also talk about sperm and how they develop and travel towards the penis. And then we'll talk about the sexual response in males, which include those three phases, which we will get to, right? How the male responds to sexual stimulation. All right, so just to remind ourselves of the anatomy here, again, we're going to glide over this. Just some important landmarks. We should know where the bladder is by this point, the vas deferens, which starts at the epididymis and ends at the ejaculatory duct. The ejaculatory duct is where the seminal vesicle and the vas deferens meet and enter the prostatic part of the urethra. We should also know by this point the membranous part of the urethra and the spongy part of the urethra. Let's remind ourselves of some additional structures, the rectum posteriorly, and we have the smooth muscle, the erectile tissue that makes up the penis. We'll talk about those structures as we go on. Let's also identify these glands. We're going to talk about the bulbourethral glands. They're found in the perineal membrane, so the floor of the pelvic diaphragm, and we're going to talk about their function in lubricating the reproductive tract. Okay, so zoning in on the male structures, we know that there are testes, there are two, and we know that they develop in the posterior abdominal wall, and by the time a male baby is born, they should have descended to their place in the scrotal sac. Now, within a single testes, if you took sort of a cross-section like this one, we would see some highly convoluted structures that are compartmentalized, about 200 to 300 within each testes. And so these highly compartmentalized structures here are seminiferous tubules. So they have a lumen. They have a lumen and they have a layer of cells, epithelial cells, that separates the basement membrane from that lumen, okay? Now, if we get more closely into this structure and look at a cross-section again here, we'll see that within the lumen of one of these tubules, we have some cells that are lining the outer surface. We have the basement membrane of this structure, and we have the lumen where the seminiferous tubules are producing sperm that enter the lumen and make their way into the vas deferens. Let's talk about some of the cells that are found in this region. Now, the cells that actually line the tubule are called Sertoli cells. And Sertoli cells, by definition, are epithelial cells, right? Remember, they're lining a hollow surface. Anytime we have that, it's an epithelial cell. And their job is really to support the development of healthy sperm. We'll talk about how sperm develop in between two Sertoli cells, make their way from the basement membrane into the lumen, and from the lumen, they can travel within the reproductive tract. Another cell we encounter in the testes is called the Leydig cell. The Leydig cell, also called the interstitial cells of Leydig, are actually found throughout the middle or the interstitial regions of the testes, so not within the tubule. If we look at this histogram over here, we can see the tubular structure, right? A cross-section of this tubular structure, the lumen in the middle here, the basement membrane, and then these Sertoli cells. And then if we look off to the side in between two of these tubular structures, we'll see those interstitial cells of Leydig. The interstitial cells of Leydig secrete testosterone, and they're going to be under the influence of luteinizing hormone, which we'll talk about, right? But they secrete testosterone. Testosterone is going to have an effect on both the Sertoli cells as well as a feedback mechanism, which we will discuss. moving on to the smooth muscle that's found around the testes. So there's a layer of smooth muscle that's just outside this basement membrane. All right, so again, just to refresh ourselves, we have the seminiferous tubule. We cut it in half, so we're looking at a cross section here. We see the lumen, where we have freshly produced sperm. We can see tight junctions in between one cell to the other. And this is really preventing communication of lymphatics and blood with the sperm that are in the lumen of that structure. We'll talk about the blood testis barrier. And then on the outside of the lumen, on the outside of the basement membrane further, we have smooth muscle. And this smooth muscle is very important in creating peristalsis. So we should know what peristalsis is. We talked about it in the GI tract. That coordinated rhythmic movement when smooth muscle contracts that helps to propel the contents of this lumen forward. Okay, so the smooth muscle is really important in making sure that the sperm are mobile and they can make their way out of the reproductive tract. Now, the blood testis barrier, again, is the area that closes off the communication between the blood and the lymphatics of the body from the sperm that's being produced. And it's formed by the tight junctions that are separating one Sertoli cell to the other. Okay, so we have the basement membrane, we have the tight junction separating one cell to the other, and we have the luminal compartment, and through that compartment is the blood testis barrier. So if I were to ask you which cell or what structure forms the blood testis barrier, what would an answer be? What cell forms the blood testis barrier? Is it the Leydig cell or the Sertoli cell? The Sertoli cells. All right, so the Sertoli cells, I like to think of them as the function of the astrocytes or the theca cells, which we'll talk about. Their role is a supportive one. They're supporting the development of the sperm as it makes its way from the basement membrane of the seminiferous tubule into the lumen. Okay, so they're going to secrete some luminal fluid that helps to get the sperm mobile and moving in that tube. They're also going to secrete AVP. AVP stands for androgen binding protein, and that helps to maintain a steady level of the amount of androgens that are found in this lumen. Okay? And so in this way, Sertoli cells help to ensure that healthy sperm are being developed and moved into the lumen. Now, the target cells of testosterone and FSH are going to be Sertoli cells. And we'll illustrate that in a minute, right? So Sertoli cells are the target of the hormone testosterone, which is secreted by the Leydig cell, as well as FSH, which is secreted by the anterior pituitary. So basically, they secrete chemicals that enhance or amplify spermatogenesis. And to remind ourselves, spermatogenesis is the development of healthy sperm into the lumen of that seminiferous tubule. Sertoli cells also secrete another important hormone. It's called inhibin. And inhibin, as the name suggests, is responsible for creating a negative feedback loop onto FSH. So FSH comes from the anterior pituitary. It's going to stimulate the Sertoli cells to secrete inhibin. And once inhibin is secreted, it's going to go back to the anterior pituitary and turn off that initial signal, which turns off the FSH secretion. So in that way, it's doing a negative feedback negative feedback loop, which turns off the initial stimulus. And we're going to illustrate that a little bit later on. Just try to work on making sure that you're following in terms of what the structures are and what their function. We're going to illustrate the details as we go on. All right, let's get to the external structures here. So the external genitalia in the case of males is the penis. It's the male copulatory organ, so it's responsible for sperm deposition. Right, just to remind ourselves, the overall goal of all of this is reproduction. So we have to get the gametes, which are the spermatocytes, from their area where they're producing the testes out to the external body in order for them to be introduced into the female reproductive tract and make their way towards the ovum to fertilize it. Now, the penis at rest is flaccid, meaning that it's not engorged. And during sexual arousal, the penis will become engorged and it will undergo what's called an erection, where it becomes full of blood. So there's increased blood flow towards the penis, which is helping to prepare the organ for emission or the deposition of that sperm into the female reproductive tract. Ejaculation is the process where that deposition takes place. And again, we'll talk more in detail about that. Other parts of the external genitalia are the scrotum. You know, the scrotum hangs beneath the testis. It's going to be suspended outside of the body. And the reason for this, we've mentioned, is to keep the sperm at a healthy temperature in order to encourage their healthy development, to maintain the viability of the sperm. So within the body, temperature is about 37 degrees Celsius, which is way too warm for healthy sperm development. And so having the testes suspended outside of the body provides a cooler environment to allow for that viable production. Okay, so just to remind ourselves, the tract that sperms take from the seminiferous tubules where they are created or developed through the retro-testes, which is a part of the testes, out to the efferent ductules. From the efferent ductules, they actually leave the testis, make their way to the epididymis. From the epididymis, they enter the vas deferens. From the vas deferens, we know that they make their way into the prostatic urethra, and then finally into the spongy urethra and out of the body. All right, so let's talk about some accessory glands and their function. So not just the ovaries and the tracts that are involved in this process, we also have some important glands. The seminal vesicles we talked about, that sort of squiggly small gland that sits at the base of the prostate, and it secretes an alkaline fluid that is rich in fructose, it has enzymes, and it has prostaglandins. Now, as we can imagine, it has all of the substances that the body needs, that the sperm needs. Right? So this sperm, think about it, this is a very high energetic process. To create sperm, to have it leave the body, make its way into another reproductive system, and maintain its viability in order to fertilize an egg. So it's going to need energy, right? Fructose. It's going to need enzymes in order to penetrate the area or penetrate the egg in order to get to the oocyte to fertilize it. So the enzymes, the prostaglandins, and the fructose are really helping the sperm in their process to make it to the egg and then to get through that egg and to fertilize it. The prostate gland secretes citrate and enzymes. Again, these enzymes are performing a similar function. The bulbar urethral gland secretes viscous fluid with mucus. And having this thick viscous fluid with mucus is another way to help prevent any bacteria from getting into this tract, prevent any sort of outside pathogens from being